Okay, hello. Welcome to our lunch break study. It is Wednesday, December 1st, 2021. It is good to see you. I am calling today, as Sandy Edwards is well aware, Rabbi White Day. We're calling it Rabbi White Day because today is the launch and the kickoff of a centennial campaign, which Sandy Edwards is the co-chair of, which is really to celebrate this community, who this community has been, the values that it has upheld, the people that it has held up over the past 100 years, and really to think about, take stock on what we've been, what we've accomplished, so that we can move forward. One of the things that I've been saying, or you'll hear me saying probably a number of times, is that, that's countercultural. That's countercultural, the idea of stopping and taking stock and looking backwards. People just move forward to the next thing quite frequently, especially here in the Bay Area. We're on to the next thing. And our tradition has a different pattern. We take the idea of doing teshuvah, doing a cheshbon hanefesh, looking back, taking stock as being vitally important. And so as our community moves into its second century of existence here in San Francisco, we really want to better understand those things that we've been in the first century. So today is Rabbi White Day because this evening we are going to be joined by scholar and educator Fred Rosenbaum. And Fred is the author of really San Francisco Jewish history. He's going to give a half an hour lecture this evening at 7 o'clock. You can register for that. Maybe Sandy Edwards can put a link into the chat if you haven't yet registered for that program. I would like to. Fred is going to share who Rabbi White was, and then we're going to be joined by Rabbi White's children, who are going to share a little bit about Rabbi White as well. And we'll also have an opportunity for breakout rooms and for some discussion. So it's going to be a really packed program this evening and a lot of fun. And Fred is just a wonderful educator. But it is not a huge amount of time for us to do what we like to do on our Sunday lunch break specials, which is to break things down, to ask really hard questions, to take a lot of time to dwell or wallow or over a particular passage, and to ask some of the deeper questions about what they mean. And so I wanted to take the opportunity for those of you who might not be aware of Rabbi White, who might not be aware that this program is happening, to go through some stuff. It might be slightly duplicative of the stuff that Fred is going to share later, but all that's going to come from his perspective. This is going to come from my perspective. Just like I shared Rabbi Lou, who I was never blessed to have met from my perspective, I'm going to share you Rabbi White, who I also was never blessed to have met with my perspective. And tonight we'll hear from those people who knew him. And so what I want to begin with here is what I always like to begin with. Let's see him and let's hear from him. And so there's not a lot of footage. I'm sorry to say there is not a robust amount of audio video footage of Rabbi White, but there is one YouTube clip, and I'm going to play it extensively here. And let me show it to you here because there's as someone, you know me, I love looking up videos. I love learning about our former rabbis here. And so there's one Rabbi White video, which is The True Meaning of Religion, Part 2. And yes, there is no Part 1. Okay, that there is. I don't know where the Part 1 exists. Maury Edelstein been very kind to put this up on YouTube. This is a sermon that was given at the Church of the Fellowship of All Peoples in October of '82. Rabbi White didn't live much longer than that. So this is probably one of his last public speeches here, and it's Part 2. So Part 1 is missing, but at least we get to hear his summation, which Fred will also play this evening. But I wanted to begin here so that you can hear him and place him within the proper context. The point, the story about Rabbi White, which we'll hear in greater detail, is that when he arrived in 1934 from New York, his wife had been a Broadway actress. He got off the train prior to the high holidays, and they brought him out here to lead their services. They had built a new building, and he got off the train with no beard, and smoking a pipe, and some of the board members seriously considered putting him back on the train. They decided not to because it was too close to the high holidays, and he ended up staying for the next 48 years. That's the origin story of Rabbi White. So he built this congregation. Pretty much what you see that the congregation has become is, to a large measure, a credit to Rabbi White's greatness as a rabbi and as a community builder. So that's him. And here he is in 82, and you'll understand from how he speaks well, I'll just share this before we see him. He has a wonderful universal ethic. He cares very deeply about all peoples. He is strongly tied to justice, which stands out throughout his career. But at the same time, strongly tied to Jewish particularism simultaneously in a way that was not the mainstream Jewish approach for many of the years throughout his rabbinate. And so we're going to hear about that this evening, and we're going to look a little bit into Fred Rosenbaum's book, Cosmopolitans, in the sections that he talks about Rabbi White's really the momentous period. There were many momentous periods in Rabbi White's career, but none more so than the Second World War. So let's hear from Rabbi White back before he passes away in one of his final speeches on the true meaning of religion.
And I must say this to the credit of my people. I told them yesterday morning at the synagogue, while many of them are prosperous, they're islands of poverty, by and large, when it comes to a national election, they will vote against their economic interests. Very interesting. They may have a ranch-style house in the suburbs, might even have a swimming pool. They may be in the upper brackets, and Mr. Reagan promises them continuous reduced taxes. They're going to vote by and large for the liberal candidates. Why? Because the whole tradition of the Bible is one of compassion, one of concern for one's fellow man. And I think my Christian colleagues miss a great deal when they emphasize only the New Testament part of Holy Scriptures, and both are sacred, which is basically a teaching of salvation, of guilt and redemption. They should use the Hebrew Bible. I've spoken to some Christian colleagues at their convocations and conferences, and they listen to it, but I don't know whether they pursue it. Let me indicate another lesson that is derived from the Day of Atonement, the most solemn, highest day of the Jewish calendar. Towards the evening, every synagogue reads the book of Jonah. What a book! Professor Cornell, a Protestant theologian I read as a youth, said that he never reads the book of Jonah without tears coming to his eyes. He says he knows that Jonah ultimately is to be saved. He knows that he's not going to be swallowed up by that big fish. But what a lesson. Jonah is a super patriot. God sends him on an errand to the people of Nineveh, telling them that their corruption and evil is beyond endurance. He's going to destroy the city of Nineveh unless they repent. And this super patriot rejoices. At last, the enemy of his people is going to be destroyed. So he pays his passage on a ship going to Jaffa, leaving Jaffa to Tarshish, runs away from God. Don't want to tell you the whole story. I want you to read it. So I'll be very brief. What happens? The ship is about to drown, to go down. The mariners pray. And then he says, it's on my account. The Lord is after me. Dump me, and the sea will be gentle, and you will be on your way. The mariners are God's-fearing people. They'll go down to the sea in ships, shall see the wonders of the Lord, says the psalmist. Sooner than later, they realize that they have to do what he wants. So he's dumped, and then he's in the belly of the, it's not a whale, the Bible says, dag gadol, a big fish. In the folk, it's a whale. And then he's spewed out on the dry land and finds himself in Nineveh. And he marches around from one end of the city to the other. Within 30 days, Nineveh will be destroyed because of its evil. The king calls a solemn assembly, they fast and they pray, and the Bible stresses they resolve to turn away from their evil ways. They're going to change their way of life. The city is not destroyed. Nineveh survives, and the prophet is still the great patriot. I'm afraid of great patriots. Patriotism in moderation. God before man. God before industry. So he sits there, and the Bible says, if I had time, read the book, because there's some very nuances, interesting nuances. What happens was, he's always catching a few naps. What is it, when you sleep a little bit? Whenever he gets a chance on the boat, an older man, he can't stay awake too long. So again, he takes a nap, and the sun hits his forehead, and he's discomforted. And then the story goes, a plant grows up. They call it a gourd. I never saw one in my life, but it's a big plant that covers his head, and he's very comforted. And then a worm eats up the plant in a short time, and again the heat, the sun strikes him, and God speaks to him and says, Jonah, are you very angry? He says, I could die. Americans would say I could spit or something like that. I could die. And God said, listen, Jonah, you took pity on this plant, which grows overnight and perishes overnight. Shall I not take pity on the city of Nineveh, which has 120,000 men, women, and children, and many beasts? Thus ends the story of Jonah. If we could only say it from all the pulpits of the country before election, this is a time of a national consensus, soul-taking, soul-searching. Guns will not solve the problem of world peace. No matter how many new neutron weapons we create, that will not solve the problem. There is hunger in the land. 10 million or more people are out of work. Their dignity as human beings is destroyed. Their family life is being shattered. Guns before bread? No. To go to the church or synagogue, as one of my Christian friends said, it goes to be smoothed out in the church. That's not the job of the church to smooth people out. The prophet said he came on a very important day of concern. People were facing a crisis. So what did the prophet say? It isn't prayer. It isn't bowing your head. That's not real religion. Real religion is to break your bread with the hungry, to clothe the naked, to see that society is just, not to cultivate great animosity for those nations that are not your way of life. Nineveh was the enemy of Jerusalem, and God said, I have compassion on Nineveh. Too much bitterness, too much hostility. And therefore, whatever years the Lord spares me, I shall try to talk to my Christian colleagues and say, look at the prophets of Israel. Don't just be priests. It's a good function to be a priest, to hallow the moments of life, birth, marriage, death. Basically, what you have to teach your people is to live with brotherhood and compassion and love, and concretely so, not to be vague. That, I think, is the message, the prophetic message that is not heard in the land. Certainly not on television. Turn on those programs. I feel distressed. All the hogwash that is being presented to the people as religion. If you believe, you'll get rich very quick. You will be in perfect health all your life. Everything that you ask will be fulfilled. Nonsense. That's not religion. Job is religion. Jeremiah is religion. Jesus, in his concern for the downtrodden, the poor, the rejected, that's religion. This is what the country needs. That's not what it's getting. I'm afraid it will not get it for a long time to come.
Does anybody want to say anything? Anybody have a thought? Yeah, Sandy.
It's so relevant to us.
I know I almost cried. I mean, oh my God. Tell me why, Sandy.
Well, he was in a political era that's very much like ours, which was this very, the economy, and the Reagan administration, which was the beginning of what we're dealing with. Yeah. And his compassion for the needy, the hungry.
Why don't we hear rabbis talk like this anymore? Why don't rabbis speak like this, Sandy, anymore?
Well, I think they do. I think there's rabbis who do. I don't think they don't speak like this anymore.
Good.
And what's interesting about him is that I think during his time, rabbis weren't speaking like this.
Yeah.
I think now there's many more rabbis that speak.
Well, I found this this was, what's the word? Edifying as a rabbi to hear this. I found it personally very fulfilling and inspirational. And the spiritual message that I agree with you is so relevant and that I need to hear right now. Judah.
Yeah, a big thank you, Rabbi, for finding that and sharing it with us. When I got to Beth Shalom, it was Rabbi Lou, so I had never had the honor or privilege. But it always surprised me because somehow he was held like, whenever I heard stories, it was like, I don't want to compare them, but more loved or more respected or whatever than Rabbi Lou. And to me, there couldn't be anybody better than Rabbi Lou. But I mean, now
it's just generational. Whichever generation was yours. It's like if you grew up with the Beatles are the best, you know?
I understand. He's like, isn't he the grandfather that we all want? I mean, isn't he just
that's interesting that you see that. Yeah.
So wonderful. But I want to, very importantly add that there is a lot of rabbis will not talk politics today, as opposed to Sharon Bruce, who I never miss one of her sermons, thank God for YouTube or whatever. But, I have a very favorite rabbi who doesn't talk, she'll talk about Native Americans, she'll talk about racial injustice, but she won't talk about the ex-president, and in my book, religion goes along with morals and ethics. You can't separate them. And my question always is to the Orthodox Trump supporters, are you reading the same Torah I'm reading? I mean, they're just, what about welcoming the stranger 37 times or something like that?
I think Rabbi White is speaking exactly to that.
He is, but
to that moral majority that was budding in '82. That's utilizing prosperity gospel and saying, why don't you read the texts here?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm saying, but I want to say that, like, where I live now in Sacramento, and my congregation's very similar to Beth Shalom in size and whatever. And yet we have a number of prominent, wealthy Republican families, which I don't think you do. You might, I don't know. But anyway, and I remember last year, 2 years ago, the rabbi was giving a sermon. It was like a week that Trump had done something really egregious. And the rabbi was giving a sermon on the Torah portion, which had to do with tyrants, and it was like the Republicans were in an outrage, but he was just doing Torah, he was just doing Torah. And so this drives me crazy that to me, rabbis should be political when it deals with ethics and morals. And I loved hearing him say that. I don't think that would, as I said, Sharon Bruce does it every week. So what I think is, few and far between. I don't know if I've ever heard you speak politics, Dan. So yeah, I still love you anyway, but whatever. We
Well, no, he addresses you a little bit there, in which he says it should be God, not man. Our concern should be on caring for the individual as opposed to the institution. Or, for me, I always get nervous. I'm not sure political ends are the way to solve some of the world's problems. I've sort of adopted a life in which I've decided to devote myself to religion as being a way to heal communities and to bring people together. And I see that sort of, and I worry sometimes that religious institutions ultimately become subservient to political ends, which I think is the danger. But we're open to disagree with that. And that's what this forum is all about. And that's what Rabbi White was all about. So let's get right into it. And we'll see if my tepidness, Judah, is mirrored by some of the reform rabbis in the 30s and 40s. Let's go take a look. All right, so let me open this up here, this document. Hold on. All right. So this comes from his book, Cosmopolitans. Okay, so here we go. Congregation Beth Shalom built a sizable new synagogue, as I was mentioning, on 14th Avenue and Clement Street in 1934 at the beginning of a demographic shift to the Richmond. Started as an informal group of worshipers after Jews first trickled into the neighborhood following the earthquake. Beth Shalom initially met in a church on 4th Avenue near Geary, where it drew a good portion of its members from the more traditional Knesset Yisroel. As their small businesses succeeded, furniture stores, laundries, produce markets, and more Jews moved into this Richmond district, and hopes rose for the formation of a major congregation. With a membership of only several dozen households, a lot was purchased, the lot where we currently are, and construction began.
Oh my God.
That's right. The turning point for Beth Shalom came when it hired its first full-time rabbi, who was 27 years old. Amazing, right? In 1935. Rabbi White was born and raised in Russian Poland. He had emigrated to New York with his family at age 12. What year was that? Let's see, if he's 27, that's 15 years prior, 1920. And he received an excellent education in the humanities at NYU before being ordained by Stephen Wise at the JIR. But the clean-shaven young man hardly looked like a rabbi, White recalled, and when he was met at the train station by a delegation of the congregation's leaders. Their image of a spiritual leader was a bearded, mature man. Realized White, their image of a spiritual leader was a bearded, mature man, realized White, but though let down, they had him conduct high holiday services since they had already paid his railway fare from the East. He remained with the congregation for almost half a century. And in his last decades, no one had more of a bearing, as we just saw, of a traditional rabbi than the leonine, hoary-headed White. Early in his tenure, inaugurating Friday evening services, he skillfully led Beth Shalom, which was still ostensibly Orthodox, towards conservative Judaism. And the congregation formally joined the movement after the war. And by 1949, membership had risen tenfold to 460 families. He was the city's foremost spokesman for Zionism during and after World War II, leading public protests and rallies, battling Rabbi Reichertz, who was the head rabbi at Emmanuel, anti-Zionist American Council for Judaism, and he raised funds for the beleaguered Jews of Palestine. But most of all, he reached thousands of households each week through a hard-hitting weekly op-ed column in the Emmanuel, which is now the J Weekly, in which he voiced sharp criticism of local Jewish establishment that he felt, here you go, Judah, too timid and assimilationist. Okay, so now let me scroll ahead to chapter 10, where he really shares with us a good deal about Rabbi White. Sorry. Okay, here we go. World War II affected California more than any other state. The defense industry became the mainspring of the state's economy, and the population grew 30% in the first half of the 40s alone. But while local Jews were preoccupied by the American war effort, they were also confronted by two cataclysmic Jewish events, the Holocaust and the struggle for Palestine, and bitterly divided in their responses to both. And we'll see, maybe this is a dynamic that persists even today. So the twin crises laid bare the extent to which the German Jewish dynasties that had led the community since the gold rush were now out of sync with the rest of the world Jewry. All right, so we have this aristocratic German Jewish community that is fully enmeshed in the life of San Francisco. So already in the late 1930s, this aristocracy in Northern California was being attacked as timid and apologetic by stirred up groups of rabbis and lay people of Eastern European origin who made their own bid for leadership based on the assertive reaction to Hitler and a ringing endorsement of Zionism. The furious battle, the large-scale collision, as the Emmanuel put it, tore Bay Area Jewry apart in 1943. Okay, so 1943, sort of a momentous year in Bay Area Jewry, in which it has to come to terms with itself. Is Bay Area Jewry going to, one, publicly oppose the Nazis? Now, that might seem obvious to you, but we'll get into why this was complicated here. And to publicly endorse the establishment of the State of Israel. These conflicts tore the Jewish community here apart in 1943. So let's go back to the J Weekly. So the local weekly, which was run by a young attorney named Saul Silverman at the time, tried mostly in vain to shake the community out of its lethargy. So it says, although Stephen Wise convened a mass protest meeting in MSG less than 2 months after Hitler's seizure of power, and similar gatherings occurred that spring in West Coast cities, including Oakland, San Francisco, did not follow suit. They were afraid of being branded as ethnocentric. All right, so it's hard to shake San Franciscans to support this effort. So Emmanuel's Rabbi Irving Reichert, who traveled to Germany in the mid-30s, also tried to prod the elite families into actions. He returned telling stories of how 600,000 of our fellow Jews were condemned as cancerous growths to be excised and destroyed. Right, so we had this effort here, but for some reason it became challenging for us as a community to oppose Nazism. All right, so let's scroll down here to where Rabbi White comes in. While most Northern Californians knew little about the Holocaust because it was afforded meager coverage by the local and national media, the Jews pretty much got their information about the unfolding catastrophe from the Emmanuel, from the J, as it's now called. At times, the Emmanuel editor was unflinching. In mid-1942, he declared nothing short of mass extermination is now going on in Warsaw. But such reports were the exception. is what Fred is going to tell us this evening. Many other vital stories on the destruction of the Jews were assigned a low priority or even ignored. Silverman barely mentions Kristallnacht, as a matter of fact. More frequently than news of the systemic murder of European Jews, the Emmanuel featured articles on the achievements of American Jews, beginning with Haim Solomon, who sold government bonds to finance the Revolutionary War. But the most attention was given to the current US Jewish heroes in the form of stories of their bravery on the battlefield. In the second half of 1944, it seemed that the paper's primary goal was to answer the anti-Semitic infamy that the American Jew is fighting the war with the blood of others. All right, so this was a real, seems to be the predominant concern here, more so, I guess, in San Francisco than in other cities in the country for reasons we'll discuss, hopefully a little bit today, that they really were very concerned with dispelling this image of the Jew who has dual loyalties and who perhaps is trying to enlist the United States of America in a war that ultimately is for a Jewish purpose and not for an American purpose. Now, when the war itself was covered, great pains were taken to ensure it would not be seen as a war for the Jews, but rather as a defense of Western civilization and even the church. So eager was the Emmanuel to find Christian allies that it gave undue weight to the vaguest expressions of sympathy from the Pope or even from a group of German bishops. Now, while the Emmanuel's display of wartime patriotism literally pushed the Holocaust off the front pages, the top Jewish lay leaders were even more cautious than Silverman was about focusing their attention on the developing disaster. Here, this is interesting. Inactivity in the face of calamity abroad was uncharacteristic of San Francisco Jewry. So there's something about San Francisco Jewry that is very much out and about when calamity takes place, held mass meetings to protest the Mortara kidnapping in 1859, the pogroms in Russia in World War I. But the elite families were uncomfortable acting in concert with Eastern European Jews. So there seems to be a split here between the German Jews and the Eastern European Jews who now formed the majority of the town's Jewish population. So the eloquent Rabbi Reichert is sort of vividly portrayed the plight of German Jewry in the 1930s. He would have been the logical person to galvanize the community, but this is Fred scholarship, he exhibited no personal warmth towards the Bay Area's Eastern European Jews, and the feeling was mutual. Far more important was his animosity towards Zionism. This is Rabbi Reichert, and full-blown by 42. Which made cooperations with the Jews outside his synagogue almost impossible. This basically isolated Congregation Emmanuel from all of the other congregations. After the rise of Hitler, during the first 2 years of the war, when we became trapped with the Nazis, American Jews came under attack for putting these Jewish concerns ahead of the common good. And in fact, Lindbergh came here to San Francisco in July 1st, 1941. And it says here he generated one of the most enthusiastic welcomes for a visitor in the city's history. The Civic Auditorium was filled hours before his speech, and thousands listened to loudspeakers outside. Although Lindbergh didn't mention the Jews here in San Francisco, several months later in Iowa, he labeled them warmongers. Right? So it's a little bit, you get the sense of where Rabbi White was walking into. Now, this local Jewish community's apprehensiveness was reflected in the long delay before the rally was held to protest the genocide. As I mentioned, in July of 42, Stephen Wise's MSG rally drew 20,000 people, got telegrams of support from Roosevelt and Churchill, but Oakland and San Francisco did not follow suit. And listen to this, when San Francisco finally held its mass meeting in the Civic Center, virtually all of the old guard chose not to participate, opting for near silence in the face of the greatest tragedy ever to befall the Jewish people. Not a great history here for San Francisco Jews at the time. However, their most powerful voice against that was our Rabbi Saul White, who was a native of Poland and a protege of Stephen Wise. And as I mentioned, he took hold of the shul in 1935, and he wrote a trenchant op-ed column that was published almost every week for 6 years in the Emmanuel. Other rabbis were cowed by the German Jewish dynasties, but White held nothing back, as you heard. As he lambasted a Jewish establishment he felt was doing the community a shameful disservice. In attacks that were more focused and sustained than those of the sardonic Denenbaum and more honest, White exposed the failings of the German Jewish gentry as no one had before or since. Early on, he expressed his exasperation with a self-appointed and self-perpetuating leadership, distrustful of the masses, suspicious of all manifestations of Jewish life, opposed to Yiddish, and mortally afraid of Zionism. As a group, he castigated the Jewish city fathers, the well-born aristocrats whose innermost wish is to assimilate and to disappear as Jews. He says the interminable delay in holding a mass meeting to protest the Nazis showed White how deeply the acid of decay has eaten into our souls. And this is a quote that Fred's going to share tonight. Above all, he rejected the argument that Jews needed to line up Gentile support. Here's what Rabbi White said: how unnatural a people we have become, that to express our sympathy with the tortured Jewish communities of Europe, our leaders urge that we must do so only if we can enlist non-Jewish organizations in the planning, that we dare not express our sorrow for the Jewish victims without doing so for others, that it would be best if non-Jews would eulogize our slain brothers and sisters. Such counsel you give us. Only against us has the enemy declared a policy of extermination and is now well on its way to realizing it. How lowly we have fallen, how poor in spirit we have become. So, you think that's still relevant? Do you think his critiques, do you think Rabbi White's critiques in 43 still hold up to this city 80 years later? Lisa's nodding yes. Tell me, Lisa. I'm going to call on you because you're nodding.
I find it a difficult point in San Francisco. The anti-Zionism is palpable to me as someone who's lived here since 1971.
It's as bad now as you've ever felt it?
I was younger and more naive when I came here. The reason I went to Ulpan in Israel in 1979 was because there was so much activism by Jews in the Bay Area on the part of every minority group except their own. I was disturbed, and I decided to go to Israel and get some sort of start on understanding.
Did you achieve any? You know, why are we this way as a community here in San Francisco? How did we, if we still bear these traits, why is that?
I think it's a really complicated question. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Ben Chin,
Okay.
because you turned your camera on, and I think this is a topic that I think is close to your heart. So are we still this way, Ben?
Yeah, a little bit. I would agree with that. But I think it's also, I mean, just generally, I think there's a lot of, I mean, I think now we would call this like allyship, right? I do think there's a feeling that you shouldn't go it alone when trying to affect political change, at least. And I think there's something to that. I mean, I do think there is benefit in bringing folks along with you, especially if they're people with more power that you have as a minority group. So I do think that's helpful, but I think, I mean, as Rabbi White is getting at, it shouldn't be a prerequisite.
Yeah, or paralyzing.
For speaking up.
Paralyzation, that's right. Yeah, Judah.
Well, for a very brief time in the 1980s, I belonged to Sha'ar Sahab before I realized I was more of a conservative Jew than a gay Jew. And we had a social action committee that went every month and picketed the Russian embassy. Let my people go. And so there we were as Jews, standing up for other Jews, mainly by ourselves.
Yeah, it's actually interesting. I'd be curious to know from other people here. I remember I was actually just talking, we had a great youngish Hanukkah dinner last night, and I was talking to a Russian emigre, and we were talking about Sharansky, and he was telling me how he met Sharansky. And I remember one of my earliest memories was my parents taking me to the big rally in the city right after they released Sharansky. Must have been 9 or 10 years old at the time. And just that was a huge deal. I remember my brother's bar mitzvah was in '86, and he had a Russian twin. What was that experience here? The Refuseniks, was that a part of? Yeah, Sandy.
Well, we were one of the leaders of this Soviet Jewry movement. David Waxberg was the national leader, and there were lots of protests in front of the Russian consulate, not just Shahar Sahav. I mean, I went there too. Lots of us did. So it was a big deal here. And a lot of Russians came, a lot of the Soviet Jews came here. And, initially it was hard for them. And in the old synagogue, when we had kiddushes, some of the Russians would bring plastic lined bags and take food home with them. And that was frowned upon, but I think they were doing it because they needed the food.
Wow.
But so there was a lot of, and Jewish Family and Children's Services, I mean, Anita Friedman deserves a huge amount of credit for the resettlement and Jewish Vocational
Oh
Service.
my gosh.
So that was all really
That's right.
strong.
Well, what's with the German Jewish community? What's with their antipathy towards Eastern European Jews? I mean, what's that about? As a German Jew yourself, Sandy, as a family of German Jews, yeah.
Well, I think that was in an earlier era. I mean, the distinguishes after generations were not so different from each other. But people looked down on each other. Germans felt that they had a higher culture than the Eastern European Jews, but that's really old history.
And it really, yeah, I agree with you. I don't think that still is in play here. Yeah.
Right. And I think that, I mean, to Lisa's point, I think now there's more apathy than with regard to Israel than there used to be. And the relationships between Blacks and Jews has changed significantly. So in Rabbi White's era, there was very close relationships, and we supported each other. I mean, the Martin Luther King with Heschel, I mean, that was the ethos of the time. Now, it's a little less comfortable because we're looked at as whites, whether or not we're Jews, and our needs and our history is, as white people, is a bit of a barrier. But there are people working with that. And as with regard to Israel, I mean, the new Israel Fund is a relatively new organization. American Jewish Congress was very active back in Rabbi White's days, early on. And American Jewish Committee has always been, but they're not as focused on Israel. I mean, they're focused more globally.
Well, let's take a look. Let's take a look about Lisa's question. Where do you stand on Zionism? Here you go, Lisa. This is from Cosmopolitans, from Fred's book. So now, while profoundly split over the proper response to the Holocaust, the Jewish community was plagued by a related and even more malevolent clash over the merits of Jewish nationalism. For nearly all of the old German Jewish families joined with their rabbi, that's Rabbi Reichert, in vigorously opposing the creation of the Jewish state. and anti-Zionism soon became more strident in San Francisco than anywhere else in the country. Rabbi Reichert, who was an apostle of classical Reform Judaism, fervently believed nationalism alien to Judaism. So he proclaimed in 1936, the Jews took upon themselves the yoke of the law, not in Palestine, but in the wilderness at Mount Sinai. And by far the greater part of its deathless and distinguished contribution to world culture was produced not in Palestine, but in Babylon and in the lands of the dispersion. So but this widely published sermon was more than a theological tract. It contained the political premise Reichert would put forth for decades to come, the dual loyalties argument. This is where he was very afraid. This is where his concern was. Reichert writes, one wonders what the Gentile world makes of all this Zionism. What do they think of us? Is it good for the Jews? It is notorious that anti-Semites, when other arguments fail, sometimes succeed in prejudicing even friendly Christians against the Jew by quoting this type of nationalistic propaganda to convict us out of our own mouths for being a nationality embedded within a nation. We may live to regret it. There might be some truth in some of the things he said, but it is hard to imagine him being able to maintain those thoughts, but he does. So it says here, he held his anti-Zionism sentiments in check for the next 6 years. Now check this out. This is really amazing. But in 1942, he forms this organization. This is Rabbi Reichert, called the American Council for Judaism, the ACJ. Only in Houston did they have a larger group there. And the ACJ was principally an anti-Zionist movement. And so listen to this. This is fascinating. 1943. Reichert, meanwhile, stunned the Jewish community by using his Kol Nidre sermon of 1943 to unveil the ACJ's program and attract members. Entitled, "Where Do You Stand?" His exhortation reiterated the dual loyalties argument and stressed the duplicity of the Zionists. On the holiest night of the year, the rabbi demanded that his listeners make a decision, take a place on one side or the other, and either join the ZOA, the Zionist Organization of America, or his American Council for Judaism. Now, why? No one actually walked out on the sermon. The highly charged speech resulted in several resignations from the temple. All right, so it's hard to really imagine in 1943 that happening here. So clearly the Jewish elite viewed Zionism as a threat to that sentiment that Emmanuel's pioneer Rabbi Elkin Kahn had written, that while Israelite, the Jew had known no other nationality, the California Jew had known no other nationality than that of American. So that was the idea, that we were American and Zionism could drive a wedge between the Jews and our neighbors. The other rabbis in town were afraid of tangling with Rabbi Reichert. Saul White, of course, refused to hold his fire, as we now know about him. And this is what he said: "The masses of the Jewish people still pray for a return to Zion," he exclaimed. "And if the council wants to make a case of it, we will accept that challenge." And throughout 1943, Rabbi White berated the ACJ in his columns. By turns, he described them as traitorous, disruptive, destructive, holier than thou, and self-hating. "It is enough to make God shed tears," he grieved. In personal conversation, meanwhile, White mocked Reichert, who smoked expensive cigars and spent too much time on the golf links, as being out of touch with the Jewish masses. But he didn't merely take the anti-Zionists to task. He also forcefully articulated the arguments for Zionism, for Jewish nationalism, emphasizing both its origins and its current necessity. Is anyone so naive to believe that the people of Poland or Germany will open their gates and reestablish the exiled Jews into jobs and positions which have since been filled by others. The only effective answer to the plight of the Jew is a homeland. And in March of 1946, Rabbi White led several Zionist groups and labor unions in a demonstration outside the downtown's consular offices. Now here, he was picketing the consulate of Great Britain, which had shut the doors of Palestine to Jews with its white paper of 1939. So he went out and marched against it. A few days later, the survey committee condemned White's protest and published an open letter apologizing to the British Consul General. Boy, we're so sorry. We're so sorry. So Rabbi White says, you don't speak for the San Francisco Jewish community. By what right do you act to nullify this effort in San Francisco? Yours is not a democratic elected body. You certainly do not represent us. Your letter to the consulate is in our minds a betrayal of the Jewish people. You people lie sick and bleeding. Your people lie sick and bleeding, and you apologize to the British government. However, as to be expected, White was no longer a columnist for the Emmanuel by this time, and he had been excised from the paper. In fact, when the paper here transferred ownership, one of the new owners, Block's first action was to drop White unceremoniously and to replace him with a series of less controversial authors. So that's a little bit the history of Rabbi White's rambunctious, outspoken lambasting of the timidity of the San Francisco Jewish community when it comes to the state of Israel and when it came to fighting the Holocaust. And this evening at 7 o'clock, Fred is going to talk in wonderful detail about that. So we're going to let Fred talk about the history because I'm not a historian here, but I'm curious to know, do you have any feels around this? Any feelings about sort of Rabbi White's approach or sort of the timidity of the German Jewish aristocracy here in San Francisco? I'm curious to know sort of what you make of all of this. I can tell you what I feel. I adore it. And I just love the idea of a rabbi who's just going to let it fly. Doesn't always work out when you do that, but I like the idea of it, of a rabbi who can really call truth to power. And I think we see that here in this sermon that we began with. He's speaking in a Christian church, telling them how to do their religion. That's intense, right? He's got no problem going to the church and telling them which scriptures to read. That's a lot of hubris for him, so good for him. But he wants to call truth to power. And what he has is just a wonderful voice that viewed that the Jewish aristocracy here in San Francisco was a part of that power and needed to be called out. Thoughts? Lisa, what do you think of this? You must like Rabbi White, huh?
I'm so sorry that I wasn't present at Beth Shalom in that era. It kind of makes me think of the story about the Grasshoppers and the Spies.
Yeah, beautiful.
And timidity is something that the Zionist project was intended to overcome. And one of the great pleasures of being in Israel for 18 months when I was there was that I was surrounded by Jewish people who were not ashamed to be Jews.
But that shame still exists here. Alan, you've been here in the Bay Area for a long time. You know a lot of Jewish communities here. What can you speak to this shame, this assimilationist trend? What is it about?
Well, I grew up in the East Bay, and I always knew that we were better than what was going on in San Francisco. Look, I grew up, first off, I wish I would have known this guy. He speaks to me. I mean, here's a guy standing up in front of religious leaders, non-Jewish religious leaders, saying that you don't get religion. This idea of feeding, clothing, supporting, caring for, that's what religion is about. I think that that's a very important message. That's the core message. And here he is having the backbone and the gall, if you will, to tell people this is what religion is about. I had no idea until now that that in general there was a reluctance to accept that the Holocaust was happening, and this was a reluctance among Jewish people in San Francisco or anywhere, but that it was happening in San Francisco was. But I grew up in the East Bay, Berkeley, Oakland, very much involved in USY. We were active in raising money for Russian Jewry. We helped smuggle Levi's blue jeans into Russia. I get that there were others who were concerned about supporting our own people and wanting other people to do it with us, but we didn't care. I mean, we were doing everything we could to support Israel, to support Russian Jewry, to support Jewry around the world as best we could, in a time when a lot of people were anti-Semitic. So I really wish I would have met this guy. I really wish I would have known him. He reminds me a lot of Harold Schulweis, who I grew up with, and he very much supported the belief I currently have in what Judaism is about. So I'm appalled by this history. I'm saddened by this history. I think we've got time to fix it and to move forward as a strong Jewish community, Bay Area Jewish community, focused on things that are wrong and helping right those things.
I totally agree with that entirely, and I don't believe it's too late to right these wrongs and to pull together our community. In fact, if anything, I think the time is ripe for doing that right now. Sandy.
Well, I just wanted to burst a little bit the bubble.
But I like him so much. Don't burst my Rabbi White myth.
Well, he was fabulous on the pulpit. And as you can see, he was fabulous. But he was a very imposing figure. He was not warm and friendly. I see Don nodding his head. He was not the sort of guy you go and bare your heart to. And he was, so from a congregational perspective, he was very differently observed. And, I remember I was in Hebrew school, like we played up by the trees, on Park Presidio, and I fell on a branch and I opened up my knee. So I'm sitting, they put me in the women's bathroom, had sort of an ante room, and there was a little divan. So I'm sitting there, he comes in, he looks at my wound and he goes out. It was like,
what's he gonna do?
I ended up getting stitches later, but it was like.
Okay, so yes, not known for his warm pastoring. That is true. But I do think is still. I think we have
nothing away from him.
No, not at all. I do think though. What's I lost my train of thought. No, that's okay. No, I remember. I do think that there's something to be said about this aversion to Yiddishism, which I have noticed firsthand since my arrival here. There is, I found a visceral response to some old world Yiddishisms that not uniformly, not in mass, but people don't like it. It reminds them of New York, which they left, or the East Coast, which they left on purpose to get away from a lot of that. And I have found that when I have tried to, because Yiddish hipsterism is a real thing in New York and in Brooklyn, and when ported over here, didn't quite have the same response. Judah.
Yeah, when I say good Shabbos, because I'm a sentimental guy And that's what my grandparents said, and good Yom Tov and whatever. And I've been accused by, I guess, woke Jews
That's right.
of Ashkenazi centricism.
Ashkenormativity.
Thank you. I'm just
I-
sentimental. What can I say?
I made that mistake the first day I was here. We had a park for the preschoolers. We were in the park, preschool families gathering up all together, going around. Hi, my name is Rabbi Ain. I'm coming from New York. I'm here to bring as much Yiddishkeit as I can to our community. Nope. Someone came up to me and reprimanded me. That's exactly right. And I just thought, but by the way, the reprimand was legitimate. We don't only want to create Yiddishkeit. Like we want to be diverse and have multivariate approaches to Judaism. That's not exclusively Ashkenazi. It's a legitimate criticism, but I stepped in it. Howard.
Here we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
My apology for the camera. It just failed me today. But the only reason I got to speak was that my parents are first immigrant Americans. Their parents hardly spoke English at all. And I remember my father, I knew spoke Yiddish, but I never heard it in the house. He really had an attitude of, we're Americans, we speak English. And I hear other people talking and I feel like I missed something, but you know, that's the way he believed. And I believe that I think he did the right thing, to be honest with you. But maybe we could have learned a little bit of Yiddish in the process.
Thank you, Howard. I want to close with one personal story. I'm sorry Ben left. I know he had a 1 o'clock, but I was going through my grandmother's personal memoir that she wrote. Ben and I do a podcast called The Jewish Frame every other week. We have a podcast, a Jewish podcast about film and a film podcast about Jewishness. This is what we're calling it. And the one we recorded yesterday was An American Tale, that awful animated movie. And I was going through my grandmother's story, the story of how my family came here. And I hadn't read this in a long time, certainly not since I moved out to San Francisco. And I found one little section here, which is not connected to what we discussed previously, but I want to share with this group because I think you'd get a kick out of it. And so my grandmother is named Mary. And in 1905, Harry Hittner, so that would be Mary's uncle, left home for San Francisco and immediately married, or maybe that's Mary's brother, had a compelling desire to join him. This is my Mary Trachtenberg is my great-grandmother, not my great-great-grandmother. Though Mary loved her mother and felt a wonderful closeness to her family, she wanted to get away. As soon as Harry settled on the West Coast, Mary wrote announcing that she would be arriving in San Francisco. My family could have been here. My great-grandmother was going to move to San Francisco to be with her brother within the month and to please find her a place to live. But Harry wrote back. What did Harry write back? Don't come. This is a wild place with loose men, loose women, drunken bums. It's not a place for a girl. Mary was insistent, but Harry was emphatic. California was no place for a decent person. He was not going to stay. He would be returning home soon. And then the earthquake came. So I just thought that was a little bit of family history that my great-grandmother wanted to move out to San Francisco in 1905. I love that. So it only took, to my great-grandmother, it only took an additional 112 years till my family made it out here. So, but it's been wonderful to learn about the history of this city and to be a part of it, to play some small role as being the senior rabbi at Beth Shalom at this moment. So if you're able to join us this evening, please do come. Great conversation with all of you, and happy centennial to our wonderful congregation. Take care.
Thank
טוב, מצוין.
you.
יפה מאוד.